Lawson Thorne didn't knock. He never did. He shoved open the door of the Sweetwater land office on a Tuesday morning, dropped a leather satchel on the clerk's desk, and said 4 words that would destroy a man's life before that man even knew he was in danger. "The Weston deed's mine." The clerk, a nervous boy of maybe 20, looked at the papers spreading across his desk like a slow flood and said nothing. Because there was nothing to say. Thorne had money, lawyers, and 30 years of practice burying people who stood in his way. He had purchased judges the way other men purchased boots. He had foreclosed on widows and called it commerce. And now he wanted the last piece of land in Garnett County that didn't already have his name on it, a frozen, struggling ranch on the northern ridge where a lonely man named Silas Weston had been quietly losing everything for 3 years. Thorne smiled at the clerk and said, "Merry Christmas." If you've ever watched someone take something that wasn't theirs and do it without shame, without hesitation, without even a flicker of doubt, you know the particular kind of rage that doesn't make noise. It just settles into the chest and sits there. That's what this story is about. That kind of wrong, and what it costs to make it right. Stay with me. If this story hits something in you, subscribe to this channel and follow along to the end. There are more stories like this one coming, and I don't want you to miss them. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to know how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to where it really begins. The advertisement had been Silas Weston's idea, and he already regretted it before the ink dried. He sat at the kitchen table the morning he wrote it with a cup of coffee gone cold beside him, and the kind of silence in the house that had weight to it. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the kind that accumulates after years of loss and becomes its own presence. He could hear wind pressing against the walls. He could hear the creak of the roof timbers settling under November frost. He could not hear another human voice because there wasn't one. There hadn't been for a long time. The paper in front of him was already wrinkled from where he'd started once, crumpled it, and started again. He wasn't a man who found words easy. He'd been a rancher since he was 17, inheriting this land from his father the same year he married Margaret, and for a long time words hadn't been necessary. The work spoke. The life spoke. There was Margaret's laugh at supper and his son Daniel's questions about everything, about how the stars worked, about what the mountains were made of, about why horses trusted people at all, and the house had never needed filling with words because it was already full. Daniel had been 8 years old when the fever came. Margaret had followed 6 months later, and Silas had not known at the time that grief could be that physical, that it could make a man's hands shake, that it could sit behind his eyes like pressure and never fully release. That had been 3 years ago. Now the ranch was failing, the mortgage payments were 2 months behind, and Harold Briggs at the Garnett County Bank had come out personally last month to explain, politely, carefully, in the tone a man uses when he wants to seem kind while doing something cruel, that the bank would be initiating foreclosure proceedings in January if the debt wasn't resolved. Briggs had looked around the ranch while he talked, looked at the broken fence posts, the patched barn roof, the thin cattle in the far pasture. He hadn't said anything about what he saw. He hadn't needed to. Silas had watched Briggs ride back toward town and stood in the yard until the cold forced him inside. The advertisement had come to him slowly, the way bad ideas sometimes do. Not as a flash of inspiration, but as a creeping logic that kept returning no matter how many times he dismissed it. He needed help. He couldn't afford to hire help. A wife, a practical arrangement, honest and clear, would mean another person working the land, splitting the labor, possibly bringing some savings or resources of her own. It wasn't romantic. Silas wasn't looking for romance. He was 41 years old and had already had the kind of love that ruins you for lesser things. He wasn't going to pretend a letter-writing arrangement would produce anything like that, but maybe it could produce something survivable. He wrote, "Rancher, 41 Colorado Territory, owns 200 acres on Northern Ridge outside Garnett. Looking for a capable woman willing to share work and life in exchange for honest partnership and a permanent home. Widower. No children. Sober man. The land is good, even if times are hard." He looked at what he'd written for a long time. Then he mailed it before he could change his mind. Clara Maddox read the advertisement 3 times in the kitchen of her sister's house in Kansas City, each time with the same stillness on her face that people who've survived real damage learn to wear when they're thinking through something dangerous. She was 36 years old. She had 5 children: Elijah, 14, Samuel, 11, Ruth, 9, Tobias, 6, and Lillian, 4. She had $42 to her name, a trunk of clothes, a sewing kit that had belonged to her mother, and a collection of geological survey maps that had belonged to her late husband, a mining assessor named James Maddox, who had taught her how to read the land the way other men taught their wives to read novels. James had been dead for 18 months. He'd been killed in a claim dispute, a man with a grievance and a rifle, and James standing between them and the wrong outcome. That was the way her sister described it, diplomatically. The truth was simpler and uglier. A violent man had shot her husband because her husband would not be moved, and Lillian had been there when it happened, and Lillian had not spoken since. Her sister Ruth had a good heart and a small house, and 3 children of her own, and a husband whose patience was not cruel but was visibly strained. Clara knew she couldn't stay. She'd known it since October when she'd seen the way her brother-in-law counted the biscuits at supper without appearing to count them, and felt the particular shame of a woman who understands she is a burden and cannot make herself not be one. She wrote back to Silas Weston in November. She did not mention the children in her first letter. She told herself it was because she didn't want to overwhelm him with information before he knew anything about her. She told herself she'd explain in the next letter, or the one after. She told herself there would be a right moment. She kept telling herself these things all the way to the stagecoach station in Denver, with 5 children beside her and a trunk tied to the back. And by then it was December and the mountains were white, and there was no going back, and she was still telling herself she'd find the right moment. It was not her finest decision. She knew that. She'd known it the whole time. Silas had borrowed a neighbor's wagon to drive into Garnet to meet the stage. The town was small enough that the arrival of the afternoon coach from Denver was still an event. A handful of people standing on the wooden sidewalk outside the hotel, the station master checking his watch against the sun. Silas stood apart from the small crowd, hat in his hands, wearing his clean shirt and the boots he'd resoled in October. He felt ridiculous. He hadn't stood at attention for a woman since he was 20 and had met Margaret at a church social, and back then he'd had the excuse of being young. He heard the coach before he saw it, the driver calling to the horses as they came down the main street, trailing a long cloud of road dust in the cold air. The stage rocked on its springs as it stopped, and the station master moved forward to pull the door open, and Silas watched. A woman climbed down first. She was not what he'd pictured, though he'd tried not to picture anything, having learned from experience that imagining the future was mostly a way to make the present worse. She was tall, with brown hair pinned under a gray hat, and she moved with the deliberate, slightly stiff motion of someone who'd been sitting for a very long time. She had good eyes, dark, attentive, already scanning the small crowd with the speed of someone who'd learned to assess situations quickly. Then she turned and put her hand up, and a boy climbed down after her, maybe 14, with a hard face and shoulders already pulled back in that particular way of young men who have taken on more than they should and are not going to admit it. Silas thought, that's odd. Then a second child came down, then a third, then a smaller boy of maybe 6 who stopped on the step and looked around with pure wide-eyed interest at the mountains and the snow. Then, last, the woman reached back up into the coach and lifted down a small girl with dark eyes and brown braids who pressed her face immediately into the woman's neck. 5 children. Silas stood completely still. The woman, Clara Maddox, he understood that now. This was Clara Maddox, the woman who had written him 3 careful letters about her willingness to work and her experience managing a household, turned and found him in the small crowd with the kind of directness that said she already knew exactly who he was and had already prepared for this moment. She walked toward him with the child still on her hip and the 4 others trailing behind her in a loose formation, and she stopped 3 feet away and looked at him steadily. "Mr. Weston," she said. Not a question. "Mrs. Maddox." His voice came out flat. He wasn't sure what else was going to come out after it, so he stopped. She held his gaze. She did not apologize. She did not flinch. She said, "I owe you an explanation, and I know it, but not here if that's all right." Silas looked at the 5 children. The smallest girl was still hiding her face. The 6-year-old was watching him with open curiosity, no fear at all. The girl of maybe 9 had her arms crossed and was looking somewhere past his left shoulder. The middle boy was reading something, actually reading, standing in the middle of a stagecoach arrival, holding a small book against his coat. And the oldest, the 14-year-old with the braced shoulders, was watching Silas with an expression that was not quite a challenge and not quite fear, and was entirely, exhaustingly familiar. It was the expression of someone who expected to be disappointed and was just waiting to find out when. Silas had worn that expression himself at certain points in his life. He put his hat back on. "I've got a wagon," he said. No one spoke much on the drive out to the ranch. Silas kept his eyes on the road. The cold had that particular December sharpness that cut through coats and settled in the joints, and the horses moved at a pace that said they wanted to be back in a warm stall. The children were wedged into the wagon bed with the trunk and the bags, and he could hear them shifting, the 6-year-old asking his mother something in a low voice and being shushed, the rustle of the little girl's coat as she settled. Clara sat on the bench beside him. She didn't try to start the conversation immediately, which he noticed and filed away. She was letting him have his anger, or whatever this was, before she tried to address it. That took a kind of discipline he recognized. It didn't make him less angry, but he noticed it. After 20 minutes of road, he said, without looking at her, "Your letters didn't mention children." "No," she said, "they didn't." That was intentional. She didn't pretend otherwise. "Yes." He turned to look at her then, just briefly. Her profile was steady against the gray sky. She wasn't bracing against what he'd say next. She was simply waiting for it. "Why?" he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Because I knew you'd say no." He turned back to the road. "You were right," he said. Another long silence. The ranch road turned off the main track here, and Silas guided the horses through the frozen ruts, the wagon tilting and swaying. From the back, the 6-year-old made a small sound of delight at the motion, quickly suppressed. "I have $42, Clara said. "I have skills, cooking, canning, sewing, livestock management. My husband was a mining assessor. He taught me what he knew." She paused. "I'm not asking you for charity, Mr. Weston. I'm offering to work." "I can see you're offering to work," Silas said. "You're also offering me 5 children I didn't agree to feed." "I know. I have enough trouble feeding myself this winter." She didn't argue with that. She said, "I know." Silas exhaled. The ranch came into view around the next bend. The house, the barn, the fenced pasture that was more gap than fence at this point, the scrubby pines bending in the wind. He saw it the way she must be seeing it for the first time. The peeling paint on the house, the hay bales that were going to run out before January, the thin line of smoke from the chimney that meant he'd banked the fire low because he was conserving wood. It looked like what it was, a place in trouble. He stopped the wagon in front of the house and set the brake and sat for a moment without moving. Behind him, he could feel 5 children not making noise, the particular held breath of children who know that something important is being decided. "Tonight," he said finally, still not looking at her. "You can stay tonight. It's too cold to put anyone back on the road. We'll talk in the morning about what makes sense." He heard Clara exhale, just barely, like she'd been holding it. "Thank you," she said. "Otan." Getting 5 children into a house that had not contained children in 3 years was a particular kind of chaos. Silas stood near the kitchen doorway and watched it happen with the slightly stunned expression of a man watching a storm make landfall. The 6-year-old, Tobias. He gathered from the way Clara said his name with the particular exasperated affection reserved for children who required more management than others, had already investigated every visible surface within reach, and was asking detailed questions about a pair of elk antlers mounted over the fireplace. The 9-year-old, Ruth, had found the broom and was sweeping without being asked, which startled him more than anything else. Samuel, the 11-year-old with the book, had put his coat and hat on a hook with methodical precision and then gone to stand near the window and look at the mountains in the evening light with the expression of someone taking notes. Elijah stood in the center of the room and did not move and did not look at anything. He was watching Silas. Not with aggression, exactly. With vigilance. The kind of watching that boys learn when they've had to be alert for changes in atmosphere. For the moment when a man's mood shifts in a direction that means everyone else should get small and quiet. Silas had seen that kind of watchfulness before. He knew what it cost a kid to carry it. Clara set the little girl, Lillian, down on the kitchen bench and took off her hat and coat, moving quickly and practically, the way women move when they're pretending everything is manageable. She looked at Silas and said quietly, over the noise of Tobias's continuing questions, "Tell me where you keep your supplies, and I'll start supper." "I'll tell you what I have first," he said, "so you know what you're working with." What he had was not much. Dried beans, some salt pork, cornmeal, a small quantity of potatoes, half a sack of oats, and some dried apples he'd put up in October. He'd been eating simply for months, calibrated to one person. He opened the pantry and showed her and waited for the look that would come, the slight widening of the eyes, the recalibration. She looked. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Cornbread and bean soup. I can make that stretch." "For 7 people?" "For 7 people." He stood back and let her work. She was efficient, not showy about it, not the kind of efficiency that performs itself for an audience, but the real kind, where every motion has a purpose and nothing gets done twice. She had Ruth and Samuel helping within 5 minutes. Tobias corralled at the table with a task that kept his hands busy. She talked to the children in a low, continuous murmur that Silas couldn't quite hear from where he stood near the fire, adding wood and trying to get the temperature in the room up before the full dark came. Elijah came and stood near the fire, not near Silas. Near the fire. But it put him in the same space, and after a minute he said, without looking at Silas, "How many cattle you got?" Silas glanced at him. 11 head, down from 30. Elijah absorbed this. "What happened to the rest?" "Hard winters. Some disease. Sold some when I had to." He paused. "You know cattle?" "Some." A beat. "My uncle had a small spread in Missouri. I helped him sometimes." Silas nodded. He didn't push it. The boy would either open up or he wouldn't, and pushing almost never helped. After a moment, Elijah said, "We're not going to be here long." Silas looked at him. "We go wherever my mother goes," Elijah said. "And she'll figure out that this isn't going to work. She always does. We're used to moving." He said it like it was a fact rather than a complaint, but Silas heard the complaint underneath it. The particular exhaustion of a kid who had been moved enough times to stop believing in the place they were in. "Maybe," Silas said. Elijah looked at him for the first time, directly. His eyes were dark and guarded and very tired for a 14-year-old. "You didn't want us here." "No," Silas said. "I didn't." The honesty seemed to catch Elijah slightly off guard. He'd been expecting deflection, or forced warmth, or one of the other things adults did when they didn't want to tell the truth. He looked back at the fire. "At least you said so," he said. Supper was cornbread and bean soup, and it was enough, barely, for 7 people around a table that had seen one person for 3 years. Tobias talked almost continuously. Ruth ate with careful attention, like someone determined not to be a burden. Samuel had brought his book and held it on his knee under the table until Clara said his name once and he put it away. Lillian sat beside her mother and did not speak and did not look at Silas, and ate about half of what was in her bowl. Silas ate and didn't say much and watched. After supper, Clara put the children to bed in the spare room, all 5 of them in a room meant for one, which was going to be a tight situation, but no one said so. Silas could hear them settling, Tobias's voice asking about something, Clara's quiet answer, and then the gradual tapering of sound. She came back to the kitchen and sat down across from him. They were both tired. He could see it in the set of her shoulders, the particular kind of tired that comes from managing an enormous amount of difficulty with a controlled face. She said, "In the morning, if you still want us gone, I'll understand. I'll find a way to the next town and figure out something from there." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Where would you go?" She didn't answer that immediately, and the silence was answer enough. She didn't know. There wasn't an obvious next place. "Your husband," Silas said. "You said he was a mining assessor." "Yes." "You said he taught you what he knew." She looked at him. "Yes." "What exactly does that mean? What do you know?" Clara folded her hands on the table. "Reading formations, identifying rock types, understanding what water does to mineral deposits over time. He had me go out with him on surveys for the last 4 years of his life. I was useful to him." She paused. "I know that sounds like a strange thing for a woman to say." "I'm not going to argue with useful," Silas said. He sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling and thought about 11 head of cattle and 2 months of missed payments, and Lawson Thorne's men who'd been seen 3 times this month on the road, past his northern property line, always moving slowly, always looking at the land. I've been watching the northern ridge, he said. Something keeps drawing Thorne's attention up there, and it's not the pasture. I've never had a reason to understand what it might be. Clara was very still. There's a ridge on this property, she said. Northern end, about a mile and a half up from the house. She was quiet for a moment. Something had shifted in her expression. Not quite excitement, but the particular alertness of someone who has been handed information that connects to something they already know. The maps, she said, almost to herself. What maps? She looked at him. My husband's survey maps. I have them in the trunk. She paused. Mr. Weston, would you be willing to show me that ridge in the morning? Silas looked at her for a long moment. Something about her attention in that moment, the focus of it, the controlled urgency, reminded him, unexpectedly, of Margaret, who had been a woman who went very still when she was thinking hard about something important. He pushed the thought away. That was a road he was not going to walk down. We'll talk about the morning in the morning, he said. Get some sleep, Mrs. Maddox. You look like you haven't had a good night in a while. She smiled, and it was the first time she'd smiled since she'd gotten off the stagecoach. It was a small smile, tired and slightly wry, and it changed her face. I can't remember the last time, she said. She went to bed, and Silas sat by the fire for a long time after, listening to the wind against the house and the creaking of the timbers and the complete changed silence of a building that now contained 7 people instead of 1. He did not know what to do. He knew he should want them gone. The logic of it was clear. 1 more mouth was a problem. 6 more was a crisis. He didn't have the food, the space, or the stability to absorb this situation. Clara had deceived him, however understandable her reasons were. The right answer, the sensible answer, was to put them on the first stage back to Denver in the morning and go back to managing his slow disaster alone. He stared at the fire. He kept thinking about Lillian, pressed against her mother's neck, with the dark eyes that had looked at him exactly once, just briefly, when he'd said, "I've got a wagon," in that flat voice, and then looked away. A 4-year-old girl who had not spoken in 18 months, who had watched her father be killed and then gone quiet in a way that her body apparently couldn't undo on its own. He thought about Elijah, saying at least you said so with the tired certainty of a boy who had been lied to enough times that honesty was worth something just for being itself. He thought about 7 people around a table and the sound Tobias had made, that involuntary sound of delight when the wagon swayed, and how long it had been since this house had heard anything like that. Silas Weston was not a sentimental man. He'd had the sentiment worked out of him by grief and years of hard work and the specific grinding pressure of a financial situation that had no comfortable exits. He was practical, and he knew it, and he leaned on it. But there was something in that house tonight that hadn't been there this morning, and he couldn't call it nothing. He banked the fire carefully, turned down the lamp, and went to bed. He didn't decide anything, but he didn't tell himself they were leaving either. And in the frozen quiet of a December night in the Colorado Territory, a rancher who had written a desperate letter and gotten something entirely other than what he asked for, lay in his own bed and listened to the sound of a house full of people breathing, and thought, not for the first time in his life, but for the first time in a very long time, that silence, after all, might not be the thing he actually wanted. He woke before the children did. That was habit. The ranch demanded early rising, the way a creditor demanded payment, without flexibility or sentiment. But this morning, Silas lay in his bed for a moment longer than usual, listening. The house had a different quality of sound. Not quiet. Not the specific hollow quiet that had been his companion for 3 years. There was breathing that wasn't his, the small, shifting weight of bodies in the spare room, and once, briefly, a child's murmur that tapered back into sleep. He got up, built the kitchen fire, and put water on before anyone else stirred. Clara came out 20 minutes later, already dressed, her hair pinned but not yet settled into its usual order. She stopped when she saw the fire going and the coffee heating, and something moved across her face. Not surprise exactly, more like a recalibration, the small adjustment a person makes when the situation is slightly different from what they prepared for. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I was up anyway," he said, which was true, and also not entirely the point. She poured herself a cup of the coffee without asking and sat down at the table and wrapped both hands around the mug and was quiet for a moment. Outside, the December light was coming in thin and pale through the east window, the kind of winter light that illuminates without warming. Did you decide anything? She asked. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the coffee. Silas sat down across from her. He'd been turning the question over since before he got up, and he still didn't have a clean answer, so he gave her the one he had. I'm not putting anyone on a road in December. Beyond that, I don't know yet. She looked up at him. She had the kind of steadiness in her eyes that came from having made a lot of hard decisions and not been destroyed by any of them, which was different from the steadiness of someone who'd never been hit. That's fair, she said. I want to see those maps, he said, and I want to show you the ridge, today, if the weather holds. She nodded, and he could tell she'd been hoping he'd say that, but she didn't make anything of it. She just drank her coffee, and after a moment said, The children will need something to do. Idle is harder for them than cold. There's fence to mend on the south pasture, he said. Elijah looks like he could handle a post hole digger. She almost smiled. He'll tell you he's done it before. He probably has. The children came out in stages, Tobias first, at a pace that suggested he'd been awake for a while and had been exercising considerable restraint by not emerging sooner. He appeared in the kitchen doorway with his hair at 5 different angles and his boots in his hand and an expression of absolute readiness for the day, as if the day had issued him a personal invitation. He looked at Silas with the same uncomplicated curiosity he'd shown at the stagecoach station. Are those your elk? He said. He meant the antlers over the fire. They were an elk, Silas said, some years back. Did you shoot it? I did. Tobias considered this with visible seriousness. How far away was it? Tobias, Clara said. About 200 yards, Silas said. Tobias's eyes went wide. He sat down at the table and began putting on his boots with the focused energy of someone who had just received important information and was processing it. Samuel came out next, book already in hand, which Silas was starting to understand was simply how the boy moved through the world. Ruth followed, went directly to the pantry and looked at what was there, and turned to Clara with an expression that clearly meant, I'm doing the arithmetic on this, and I have questions. Clara gave her a small nod that clearly meant, I know, I'm on it. Elijah was last. He came out already fully dressed, coat and all, like he'd been waiting for a signal. He looked at Silas without greeting him, not with hostility, but with that same watchful assessment, checking the atmosphere for whatever the day intended to deliver. Silas said, There's fence work on the south pasture. Post holes need digging. You'd be helping me out. Elijah looked at him. A beat. Then, all right. Just like that. No negotiation, no performance. All right. It was, Silas thought, a very straightforward kid underneath all that armor. Lillian did not come out of the bedroom. After a few minutes, Claire excused herself and went back in, and Silas heard her low voice, and then nothing, and then she came back and said quietly, She'll come out when she's ready. She's like this sometimes. New places take her longer. Silas nodded. He didn't ask more than that. The south pasture fence was worse than Silas had admitted to himself. He hadn't walked it in 2 weeks. There'd been no livestock in that section since October. And the November storms had knocked down 3 complete sections, post and wire both, the frozen ground having surrendered whatever grip it had had. Silas stood at the edge of it with Elijah beside him and did a mental count of what this was going to cost in labor and time and said nothing for a moment. Elijah said, You want to start at the east end or the west? Silas looked at him. East, he said. The posts there are still solid. We're replacing wire mostly. Elijah nodded and picked up the spool of fencing wire from the wagon without being told and started walking east. Silas followed, and they worked for the better part of the morning in a quiet that was different from the silence Silas had been living in. This was the quiet of 2 people doing physical work in proximity, productive quiet, punctuated by the sounds of effort and the occasional short exchange. Hold that post. It's moving. I know. Put your weight on it from the other side. The boy was strong for 14, and he knew how to work without wasting motion, which was something you either had or had to beat into muscle memory over years. Silas watched him hammer a staple with 3 clean strikes and thought about the uncle with the spread in Missouri. How long were you in Kansas City? He asked during a rest. Elijah was breathing hard from the post hole work. He didn't look up. 8 months. Before that? Nebraska. Before that, Iowa. Before that, he stopped. We've been a lot of places. Since your father died? A beat. Elijah's jaw moved. Since before that, Pa moved us for work. He was gone a lot. He set down the digger and picked up the wire cutters. After he died, it was just, we couldn't stay where we were. Money. Other things. He didn't elaborate on the other things, and Silas didn't push. Your mother, Silas said after a while. She know what she's doing? With the maps, the geology work? Elijah looked at him then. For real. Direct. My mother, he said, is the smartest person I've ever met. She just had the bad luck of being born into a time when that doesn't count for much, unless there's a man attached to it. He said it without bitterness, just as a statement of fact that had been arrived at through careful observation. Silas turned it over and said nothing. They worked until midday. When they came back to the house, something was different. It took Silas a moment to identify it, and then he realized it was the smell. Not just the bean soup Clara had started that morning, though that was there, but under it, something that said someone had been working inside this house in a purposeful way. He looked around the kitchen. The floor had been swept. The window above the sink was clear. He'd let it go cloudy with winter grime and hadn't noticed because there was no one else to notice. The string of dried herbs on the far wall that had been leaning at a precarious angle for 4 months had been straightened and rehung. Ruth was at the table recovering a crack in the bench seat with a strip of cloth, working with a needle and heavy thread with the concentration of someone who'd learned to make things last, because things not lasting was an event with consequences. She found the fabric in the chest in the corner, Clara said, from near the stove without turning around. I told her to ask first. Silas looked at the bench. It had been bothering him for 6 months. He'd sat on it every day and not fixed it. It's fine, he said. Samuel had commandeered the small table near the window, the one Silas used to pile mail and papers, and had arranged the geological survey maps on it. He was leaning over them with the concentrated frown of someone trying to decode a language they half knew. He looked up when Silas came in. These maps are your husband's? Silas asked. My father's, Samuel said carefully. He made annotations in the margins. I've been trying to read them. He looked back down at the paper. His handwriting was hard to read even for my mother. Clara came to stand beside them. She pointed to the northern edge of one map without touching the paper. This is your property line here. This ridge, her finger moved, tracing a line that followed the mountain contour. This runs along the northern boundary. Silas looked at where she was pointing. You know this area? I know what the rock formation suggests. James surveyed a similar ridge in Nevada in 1874. He wrote me letters about it. She glanced at him. He wrote me very specific letters. He liked explaining things, Samuel said quietly, still looking at the map. He told her everything he knew because he said a woman with a good mind who didn't know anything about the world was just a waste of a good mind. He said it without inflection, reporting a fact, and then went back to studying the margin notes. Clara looked at him for a moment with an expression that was held very carefully in place, and Silas understood that the boy had repeated something he'd heard his father say, and that the hearing of it was still tender. We should go up this afternoon, Clara said, her voice steady again. The light will be good before 3 o'clock. The ride up to the northern ridge took 40 minutes. Silas hadn't been up there in nearly a year. The track was overgrown in places, narrowed by brush and the heave of frost in the soil, and the horses picked their way with the careful distrust of animals that knew ice and weren't interested in surprises. Clara rode beside him on the spare horse she'd asked, not assumed, which he'd noted, with James Maddox's field notebook in her coat pocket. When they came out onto the ridge itself, the view opened up in the way it sometimes did in mountain country, sudden and total. The whole eastern valley spread below them under the December sky. Silas had stopped noticing this view years ago. He noticed it now, briefly, because Clara stopped her horse and looked at it. How much of that is your land, she said. Everything from the creek to that far tree line. He paused. For now. She turned her attention to the rock. She was different up here. She dismounted without ceremony and walked to the exposed face of the ridge where the stone came through the soil, and she crouched down and looked at it with the focused attention of a person reading text, picking up a piece and turning it in her hands, setting it down and moving 10 feet to the left and picking up another. Silas watched her. She didn't perform the knowledge. She just used it, quietly, moving along the rock face with the notebook out now, writing things down in small, quick notations. After 10 minutes, she stopped and stood and looked at the line where the rock formation ran diagonally toward the north. "Tell me something," she said. "Has Thorne been up here?" "His men have been seen on the road below. I don't have proof they came up." "But you think they did?" Silas thought about the 3 occasions when he'd found horse tracks on the upper property that didn't match his own animal's shoes. "I think they came up." She turned to look at him. Her face was very serious. "Mr. Weston," she said, "what does Lawson Thorne actually want with your land? Does he give reasons?" "He says the pasture would add to his grazing range, that my cattle operation is inefficient and the land would be better used as part of his operation." Silas paused. "He's been saying it for 6 years. I didn't believe the pasture story when he told it the first time." Clara looked back at the rock face. "He knows," she said, "or he suspects strongly enough that it comes to the same thing." She held out a piece of stone. "This is galena, lead sulfide. It's a host rock. Where you find galena in this formation, near granite intrusions like that line up there, you find silver." Silas took the rock. It was heavy, dark gray with a metallic shine on its fresh broken face. "How much silver?" he said. "I don't know. I'd need to do more survey work, pull samples from several points along the formation." She met his eyes. "But enough that a man like Thorne would want the land before the owner found out." Silas held the rock and thought about Harold Briggs at the bank with his polite face and his foreclosure paperwork, and Lawson Thorne's men riding slowly on the road below this ridge, and a leather satchel dropped on a land office desk with 4 words spoken like they were already true. "He's not waiting for foreclosure," Silas said slowly. "He's engineering it." Clara said nothing, because she didn't need to. The ride back was faster and quieter. Silas was thinking hard enough that conversation would have been a distraction, and Clara seemed to understand this without needing it explained. She rode beside him with the notebook closed in her lap and let him have the silence. What he was working through was this. If the ridge contained silver, real silver, not trace amounts but a workable deposit, then his land was not worth the $3,000 the bank said it was worth. It was worth 10 times that, maybe more. And Thorne knew this, or believed it, and had spent, how long, positioning himself to acquire the property at its undervalued price before anyone else understood what it held. The foreclosure proceedings, the pressure, possibly the delays in refinancing he'd tried twice and been turned down on, both times by Garnet County institutions where Thorne had relationships. All of it lined up into a shape that made Silas's chest tight with a slow, controlled fury. They got back to the ranch as the light was going gray. Tobias met them at the barn, already mid-sentence before they'd dismounted, describing something that had happened with one of the barn cats that involved a significant amount of drama. Silas let the story wash over him and unsaddled the horses and fed them, and by the time he came inside, the fury had settled into something more useful. A cold, clear intention to not let Thorne win. The problem was, he didn't yet know how to stop him. Supper that night was better than the previous one. Clara had found some things in the cellar Silas had forgotten about. A jar of tomatoes he'd put up in September, some dried venison from a fall hunt that he'd overlooked behind a crate, and she'd worked them into the soup with the cornbread and produced something that was, against all reasonable expectation, actually good. Not just adequate, good. Silas ate and said, because it was true, and he was not a man who withheld things that were true. "That's better than I've cooked for myself in about 2 years." Clara said mildly, "The tomatoes helped. I forgot I had them." "I noticed," Tobias said without looking up from his bowl. "Mama always finds the food, even when there isn't any." Ruth said, "Tobias." "What?" "It's true." Silas looked at Tobias, this irrepressible 6-year-old who had inserted himself into the ranch's life with the confident ease of someone who had never considered that he might not be welcome, and felt something in his chest that he didn't entirely know what to do with. He looked down at his bowl. Across the table, Lillian sat in her usual position beside Clara, eating quietly. She'd come out of the bedroom eventually that morning, once the house was full of movement and noise, and had orbited the edges of activity all day. Close enough to observe, far enough to retreat. She hadn't spoken. She didn't look at Silas, which he'd been careful not to push against or make pointed, but when he looked up from his bowl, she was looking at him. It was a brief thing, 2 seconds, maybe, her dark eyes on his face, with an expression that was not readable in the way expressions on most children's faces were readable. She'd learned something about keeping her interior weather private, this little girl, in the same way older people learned it. When she saw him look back, she looked away. Silas ate. He thought, 18 months of silence, since her father died. He thought about Daniel, who had been a talker, who had never in his 8 years on earth let a thought go unexpressed if he could help it. And he thought about how a house full of sound could go silent all at once, and what that did to the space where the sound used to be. He did not say any of this. He finished his supper and helped clear the table without being asked, which seemed to catch Clara off guard, though she said nothing. After the children were in bed, Silas spread the survey maps on the kitchen table. Clara sat across from him with the field notebook open, the lamp turned up as far as it would go. Outside, the wind had picked up in the way December winds did in the mountains. Not a gradual building, but a sudden shift, like the weather had made a decision. The house shuddered slightly against it. If we want to file a mineral claim, Silas said, we'd have to go to Denver. Yes, the Territorial Land Office. Thorne will have people watching the claim office. He probably has someone there who reports to him. Clara nodded. If he finds out we know about the silver before we file, he'll move faster. Silas looked at the map. He might challenge the filing. His lawyers are better than anything I can access in Garnett County. The filing itself isn't complicated, Clara said. I've watched James do it. You need the legal description of the land, a description of the mineral deposit, and a locator, someone who physically marks the claim on site. We can do the marking ourselves. She paused. The strength of the claim depends on the survey documentation. The more detailed, the harder to challenge. How long would that take, the survey documentation? A week, maybe less if conditions hold. She looked up at him. The problem is getting to Denver without Thorne knowing what we're doing. Silas thought about the roads, the passes, December conditions, the distance. 2 days by stage from Garnett if the weather holds. Could be 3 or 4 if it doesn't. We'd need to time it carefully. We'd need a reason to go that doesn't look like what it is. He sat back. I've got supply runs I've been putting off. That's not suspicious. Clara was quiet for a moment. There's something else. He looked at her. Thorne isn't just watching the ridge, she said. He's watching your finances. The bank proceedings, that's not coincidence. He knows exactly when you're most vulnerable. Silas said, You think he has someone at the bank? I think Harold Briggs didn't come out to your ranch on his own initiative. She held his gaze. A man like Thorne doesn't wait for accidents. He makes them. The understanding of it settled in the room between them, the full shape of it, the years of it, the deliberateness. Silas felt the fury again, cleaner now, no longer hot. Cold fury was more useful. If we file successfully, he said, he can't foreclose on land with an active mineral claim in dispute. That would require federal adjudication. That's right, which buys us time and removes Briggs from the equation. Silas nodded slowly. He looked at the map, the ridge line, the formation. Clara had traced with her finger this afternoon, running north toward the timber, host rock for something that had been sitting under his property for longer than anyone in the Weston family had known to look. His father had bought this land because the grass was good. He'd never known what the rock held. We start the survey work tomorrow, Silas said. Talk. They started at first light. It became the pattern of those first days. Silas and Clara up before the children, the survey work in the morning on the ridge while Elijah took charge of the ranch chores with a competence that remained to Silas slightly astonishing. The kid organized his siblings into a genuine working unit. Samuel fed the cattle and took notes on which animals seemed thin and which seemed stable, because noting things was what Samuel did with any situation. Ruth managed the house with an efficiency that suggested she had been doing versions of this her whole life. Tobias was theoretically assigned tasks that were theoretically within his capacity, though in practice, Tobias's capacity was distributed across a wide range of enthusiasms and actual task completion required monitoring. Lillian stayed close to Ruth or to Clara when Clara was in the house, and said nothing, and sometimes sat near the window and looked at the mountains with an expression Silas had no name for. On the ridge, the survey work was meticulous and slow. Clara worked with James Maddox's instruments, a Brunton compass, a hand level, a sample bag collection she'd carried from Kansas City. and Silas held things and carried things and asked questions when he had them. He learned more about reading rock formations in 4 days than he'd known existed to learn. Clara taught without performing the teaching. She just explained what she was doing and why in the same tone she used for everything else, direct and clear and without condescension. "This one," she said on the 3rd day, crouching over a sample near the ridge's eastern end. "This one's different from the others." Silas looked at it. It looked like a rock. "Different how?" "Heavier. That luster on the face. Not galena. That's argentite." She turned it in her hands. "Silver sulfide. This is what you're looking for." He crouched beside her. The rock face had a dark metallic sheen where the break was fresh. "How confident are you?" he asked. She turned the sample over once more. "Confident enough to file." On the 4th day, Thorne's men came to the ranch. There were 2 of them, and they came at midday, when Silas and Clara were still on the ridge. Elijah was the one who saw them ride in. He was mending tack in the barn doorway and heard the horses before he saw them. 2 men, large, with the look of hired muscle rather than legitimate hands. They sat on their horses in the yard and looked around the property with the deliberate slowness of people making a point. Elijah came out of the barn and stood in the yard and looked at them. He was 14 years old, and he did not step back. "Can I help you?" he said. The nearer man looked down at him. "Weston around?" "No." "When's he back?" "Don't know." The man looked around the property again, at the barn, the house, the fenced areas, with the unhurried inventory of someone assessing value, or assessing vulnerability. He looked back at Elijah. "You tell him Mr. Thorne would like a conversation, at his convenience." "I'll tell him," Elijah said. The men rode out. Elijah watched them go all the way to the main road. When Silas and Clara came down from the ridge 2 hours later, Elijah told Silas about the visit with the flat, precise economy of someone who had thought about how to report it and decided brevity was right. Silas listened. He asked, "Which direction did they ride when they left?" "North," Elijah said. "North. Toward the ridge road." Silas looked at Clara. She had already understood. "They know we've been up there," she said quietly. "Or they saw us and reported it. How much time do you think we have?" Silas thought about Thorne, about the way the man operated, systematically, through institutions, through proxies, keeping his own hands clean. He wouldn't move overtly without preparing the ground first. He'd want legal mechanisms in place. "A week," Silas said. "Maybe less." That night he wrote to a man in Denver he'd done business with once, a lawyer named Garrett Hale, who had a reputation for not being afraid of powerful men, which was rarer than it should have been. He didn't explain everything in the letter. He said only that he needed a consultation on a mineral claim and that time was a factor, and he would arrive in the next 10 days. He sealed the letter and gave it to the stage driver the next morning to carry to Denver. The thing with Lillian happened on the 6th day. It was evening, after supper, and the kitchen had reached that complicated state of partial settling that happens when a house contains people of multiple ages. Tobias technically in bed, but audible. The older children in various stages of winding down. Clara at the table writing in her own notebook. Silas was near the fire, going over numbers on a piece of paper for the 3rd time, as if they might change if he looked hard enough. He heard small feet on the floor. Lillian came around the end of the kitchen bench and stood about 5 feet from the fire. She was in her nightgown, her braids coming partially undone, looking at the flames with an expression that was either calm or very far away. He couldn't tell, and he'd learned not to assume. He did not say anything to her. He did not make a fuss of her presence. He just moved slightly on his chair to make the space near the fire more obviously available, in the way you might do for any person who wanted to be warm. She stood there for a while. Then she came and sat on the edge of the hearth, close but not touching, and watched the fire. Silas went back to his numbers. They sat like that for maybe 15 minutes. The fire settled and popped. Outside, the wind moved through the pines in long, slow waves. Then Lillian said, very quietly, not looking at him, "Does it ever stop being cold?" Her voice was small and a little rough from disuse, and it landed in the room with the particular weight of something that hasn't been used in a long time suddenly being required again. Silas was still for a moment. "In the spring," he said. "It stops in the spring." She didn't say anything else. Neither did he, but she stayed by the fire until Clara came and found her and took her to bed. and Clara looked at Silas over Lillian's head with an expression that he couldn't fully read and that stayed with him after the lamp was out. He lay in his bed and stared at the ceiling. Does it ever stop being cold? He thought about a little girl who had seen something that made her go silent for a year and a half, and had come through some weeks of winter travel in a strange house, and a man she had no reason to trust, and had found her way to a fire, and asked a simple question as if she were testing whether the world would answer. And the world, in the form of a rancher who had been losing everything for 3 years, had said, in the spring. It was not much. It was not much at all. But he stayed awake for a long time thinking about it, and in the morning he was up before the fire died, feeding it back before the kitchen went cold, because someone had asked him when it would stop and he'd said spring, and he meant it. The survey was almost finished. The letter was in Denver. The claim documents were drafted in Clara's neat hand on the table under a coffee cup. And somewhere to the north, Lawson Thorne was making plans of his own, moving with the patience of a man who had never once lost anything he'd decided to take, and did not yet know that a woman with her dead husband's maps and a rancher with nothing left to lose had found something in the rock that was going to make him very sorry he'd ever looked twice at the Weston land. The letter from Garrett Hale arrived on the 8th day. Silas recognized the Denver postmark before he'd even broken the seal, and he read it standing at the end of the drive in the cold, with his coat not fully buttoned because he hadn't wanted to wait until he got back to the house. Hale's handwriting was the cramped, confident script of a man who wrote a great many letters and had no patience for flourish. The message was short. He could see Silas on the 15th, not before, as he had court obligations through the 14th. He noted that mineral claim consultations required documentation of the deposit location, existing deed records, and any evidence of prior claims or encumbrances. He also noted, in a single dry sentence at the bottom, that he was aware of Lawson Thorne's land acquisition history in Garnett County and suggested Silas bring everything he had. That last line told Silas more than the rest of the letter combined. He walked back to the house and put the letter on the table in front of Clara without comment. She read it. She looked up. The 15th, she said. 7 days. We can have the survey complete by the 11th. 2 days of travel. She calculated. We'd need to leave the 12th at the latest. The weather is the problem. Silas sat down. The northern pass can close in an hour this time of year. If we're caught between Garnett and Denver in a bad storm, we go by the valley route. It's longer but lower. She paused. And less visible. He looked at her. You've thought about this. I've been thinking about it since the men came to the yard. She folded her hands on the table in that way she had, settled, deliberate, the gesture of a woman organizing her interior weather before she spoke. There's something else we need to discuss. The children. We're not leaving them here alone. No, but we can't take all 5 to Denver, not on a 7-day round trip in December, not with what's at stake. She met his eyes. Elijah is old enough to manage the ranch for a week. He's been doing it with me here. He could do it without. He's 14. He's more capable at 14 than most men are at 30. She said it without exaggeration, just as observed fact. Ruth would help him. And Nora Callahan, your neighbor on the South Road, would she check in? Silas thought about Nora Callahan, who was 62 years old and had been managing her late husband's spread alone for 4 years, and would, if he asked her, probably consider checking on 5 children, a reasonable request and a reasonable neighbor, a fair exchange. She'd brought him a pot of stew 2 months ago without being asked, and hadn't made anything of it. She'd do it, he said. Then we take Tobias and Lillian with us. They're too young to leave. That's still a rough trip for a 6-year-old and a 4-year-old in December. Clara looked at him with the particular expression of a woman who has performed the arithmetic of hard situations enough times to know that the question isn't whether the options are good, only which one is least bad. I know, she said. But I know my children. Tobias will be fine. He's made of something close to rubber. Lillian, she stopped. Then, Lillian needs to be where I can see her. Silas didn't argue that. He had no standing to argue it, and beyond that he thought she was right. We'll need to be ready to leave at an hour's notice, he said. If Thorne moves faster than we think, then we leave faster than we planned. She pulled the survey notebook toward her. Let me show you where we still need samples. They didn't get the full 7 days. On the 10th morning, 2 days before Silas had planned to depart, he woke to the smell of smoke. Not the wood smoke of a morning fire. Something sharper, thicker, with the particular wrongness of smoke that is eating something it shouldn't be eating. He was out of bed and to the window in 3 seconds, and he saw the orange light against the dark and understood immediately what it was before his mind had fully formed the thought. The barn was on fire. He shouted for the house to wake as he ran out the door, and behind him he heard the sounds of people coming instantly alert, children's voices, Clara's fast footsteps. He crossed the yard at a run with the cold hitting him full in the face, and the barn door was already hot on the near side, and through the gap at the bottom came the yellow flicker that meant the straw had caught and was carrying it. He got the barn door open and the horses panicked immediately, which was the only right response a horse had ever had to fire, and getting them out was a matter of brute physical engagement. One hand on a halter, his weight against 1,200 pounds of terrified animal, talking in the low, continuous voice that meant, "I am here, move, move, now." The first horse came out. He went back in for the second. The smoke was bad. His eyes were streaming before he'd taken 3 steps back inside, and the heat above him was moving fast. The loft had caught, hay burning with the speed of dry tinder in a closed space. He found the second horse by sound, backed it out by force, got himself out 2 seconds before a burning beam dropped across where he'd been standing. Elijah was outside with a bucket. Samuel had found another. Clara had the children in a line to the water trough. Even Tobias, who was hauling a bucket with both hands and a ferocious expression, and they worked for 40 minutes on the south wall, which was the closest to the house, keeping the flames from spreading, and by the time dawn came fully, the barn was gone, but the house was standing and the animals were safe. Silas stood in the yard and looked at what was left. The structure was down to its stone foundation and a few scorched posts. 3 years of his father's work. The tools stored inside, the good ones, the ones he'd been maintaining because they were worth maintaining, gone. The winter hay he'd managed to buy in October for the cattle, gone. The tack Elijah had been mending, gone. Clara came and stood beside him. She was covered in ash and her hair had come entirely free of its pins, and her face had the specific blankness of someone processing damage. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "This was deliberate." "Yes," he said. "They couldn't know we were leaving in 2 days." "Maybe they did know." He turned to look at her. "Thorne has eyes in garnet. If Hale's clerk talked, if anyone saw me mail that letter, they're trying to make us decide the land isn't worth it." She looked back at the ruins. "That's what this is. They want us frightened and broke and convinced that fighting costs more than leaving." Silas looked at the ruins of his barn and thought about his father building it with 2 neighbors in the summer of 1861, and thought about the letter from Harold Briggs, and thought about 2 men sitting on horses in the yard while a 14-year-old stood alone and did not step back. "We leave tomorrow," he said. Clara looked at him. "Not in 2 days. Tomorrow. We pack what we need tonight." He turned toward the house. "Elijah." The boy was 10 feet away, still holding the empty bucket. He'd been listening. "Yes," he said. It wasn't a question. "I need to talk to you about what you'll be managing while we're gone." Elijah set the bucket down and straightened his shoulders in that way he had, the instinctive squaring up of a boy who has been asked to carry things and has learned not to show what it costs. "All right," he said. "Tell me." The conversation with Elijah took an hour. Silas sat with him at the kitchen table after the others had gone to wash the ash off and eat what Clara had quickly put together, and he went through it the way he would have talked to a foreman, directly, with specifics, without softening. The cattle needed to be checked morning and evening. The south fence section they'd repaired was holding but needed watching after any hard wind. Nora Callahan would come by on the 2nd and 4th days, and she knew livestock. Her opinion was worth having if he was uncertain about anything. The supply of feed corn in the cellar was enough for 10 days if he rationed it carefully. Elijah listened and asked 3 questions, all practical, all showing he'd understood the shape of the problem, not just the surface of the instructions. One of the questions was about what to do if Thorne's men came back. Silas was quiet for a moment. "Don't engage them," he said. "Don't argue with them. If they come in the yard, tell them I'll be back shortly and you'll pass along any message. Don't let them inside the house." "And if they try to come in anyway?" Silas looked at him. The question wasn't hypothetical. Elijah had already imagined this scenario, and the expression on his face said he had imagined it all the way to its uncomfortable conclusion. "There's a rifle in the cabinet over the fireplace," Silas said. "The key's on a nail behind the coffee tin. I'm not telling you to use it. I'm telling you where it is." Elijah nodded. He didn't look alarmed. He looked like someone who was simply completing an inventory of the available facts. "I'll keep Ruth and Samuel inside after dark," he said. "That's a good idea." They sat for a moment. Then Elijah said, in a different voice, quieter, the armor down an inch, "Will you be able to file the claim in time?" Silas looked at him. "We're going to try." "My mother is right about the silver." Elijah said it as a statement of faith and a statement of fact simultaneously. "She's right about most things she studied. She was wrong about some things with my father and with other things. But when she tells you she knows what rock looks like, she knows." "I believe her," Silas said. Something shifted in Elijah's face, the smallest adjustment, barely visible, like a door opening a quarter inch. "Good," he said, and pushed back from the table. They left before sunrise. The wagon was packed in darkness, Clara moving with quiet efficiency, while Silas hitched the horses, both of them working around the fact of the ruined barn. Maneuvering in the open air where the structure had been, the stone foundation already frosted white in the night cold. Tobias, being informed he was going on a journey, had achieved immediate and complete wakefulness at a pitch that suggested it was going to be a very long first day. Lillian was awake and dressed and standing near Clara, with her small bag packed with a seriousness that made her look, in the pre-dawn darkness, like a very small person with a great deal of interior life. Silas helped her up into the wagon. She looked at him when he lifted her, just briefly, that same considering gaze she'd turned on him at the hearth. She didn't pull away. He settled her on the bench and wrapped the lap blanket around her, and she held it in place with both hands, with a careful, deliberate motion that struck him as being very like her mother's. Elijah stood at the end of the drive. He and Silas looked at each other in the cold dark. "I'll come back with what we need," Silas said. Elijah nodded. He looked very young standing there and very old at the same time, the way some kids looked when they'd been handed the kind of responsibility that didn't allow for being whichever one was more convenient. "I know," he said. Silas got up on the wagon. Clara was beside him with the survey documents and the deed and James Maddox's notebooks, wrapped in oilcloth in the bag at her feet. She raised her hand once to the 3 children standing in front of the house. Ruth, with her arms around Samuel's shoulders, Tobias vibrating beside them, and then looked forward. The horses moved. The ranch fell behind them in the dark. The valley route to Denver was not a bad road in summer. In December, in the week before Christmas, with the kind of cold that had been building for 10 days, it was a road that required complete attention and a certain tolerance for difficulty. Silas drove and said little, keeping the pace as steady as the terrain would allow, watching the sky and the track alternately. Clara sat beside him and kept the children occupied when they needed occupying, which was more of an ongoing project with Tobias than with Lillian, who spent large parts of the first day watching the country they moved through with an attention that reminded Silas of Samuel. They stopped twice for water and rest, the second time at a creek crossing where the horses needed the break, and Tobias urgently needed to investigate the creek bed for interesting rocks, a project Clara permitted for exactly 10 minutes before declaring it complete. "He found a green one," Lillian said. Silas looked at her. It was the 3rd time she'd spoken. The voice was still rough-edged from disuse, but it was coming more readily. "Green ones are good," he said seriously. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked back at Tobias, who was being extracted from the creek bed with the particular reluctance of a child who has not yet finished doing something important. By nightfall, they'd made it to Harker's station, a relay stop and rough-in on the valley road that Silas had used twice before. It wasn't comfortable. It was warm, which mattered more. The innkeeper, a large taciturn woman named Mrs. Broom, put them in 2 rooms without comment. She fed them salt beef and boiled potatoes at the common table, and when Tobias fell asleep with his head on the table between the plates, she produced a blanket from somewhere and dropped it over him with a practicality that suggested she'd seen this situation before. Clara looked at Silas across the table over the sleeping child. "How far do you think they'll go?" she said quietly. "Thorn. Burning the barn was a warning. What's next?" Silas thought about what he knew of Lawson Thorn, which was built from 6 years of proximity and observation and the accumulated testimony of other ranchers who'd been through versions of what Silas was going through now. Thorne ran his operation through a combination of legal pressure, financial strangulation, and the kind of low-level intimidation that was very difficult to prove and very effective at making people believe that resistance cost more than compliance. "He'll move on the deed," Silas said, "while I'm gone. He'll use whatever Briggs has given him from the bank proceedings to file some kind of encumbrance or pre-claim on the property. Try to complicate the title before I can file the mineral claim." Clara absorbed this. "Can he do that without notice to you?" In this territory, a man with good lawyers and friends in the right offices can do a lot of things that technically require notice without actually providing it. He paused. "Which is why we need to be in Denver before he finds out we've left." She looked at him. "You think he doesn't know yet?" "I think the men who burned the barn reported back that it was done and that we were shaken. I think Thorne expected us to spend a week trying to rebuild instead of moving." Silas picked up his coffee. "He underestimated the timeline. People like him usually underestimate the timeline," Clara said, "because they're used to making others wait." The second day of travel brought the weather. It came from the northwest in the early afternoon, the sky closing down from that direction with the particular gray-blue density that meant business. Silas watched it for an hour before saying anything, calculating the distance to the next shelter, a farm belonging to a man named Eccles, who let travelers camp in his hayshed for $1, against the speed at which the front was moving. He concluded they were going to get wet before they got to Eccles's, and he was right. The snow came sideways, driven by a wind that found every gap in coats and collars, and within 30 minutes the road was obscured enough that Silas was navigating by familiarity with the terrain rather than by sight. Clara had Lillian inside her coat as much as possible, which was physically awkward but effective, and Tobias had buried himself in the lap blankets with the pragmatic self-preservation instinct that children sometimes displayed when conditions were bad enough to override excitement. They made Eccles's farm in 2 hours. The hayshed was cold, but it was dry and out of the wind. Silas got the horses settled and came back to find Clara had already organized the small interior into something livable, blankets spread, the food bag open, children stationed in the warmest corner against the wall. She handed him a piece of dried venison without ceremony. "Tobias's hands are cold," she said. "Can you—" He sat down across from Tobias, who was holding out his hands, with the expression of someone who has decided that being cold was an acceptable trade for adventure, but was revising that position. Silas took the small hands in both of his and held them until the color came back, which took several minutes and required Tobias to talk about the green rock he'd found at the creek, its size, its likely composition, whether it was valuable, whether it was the same as the rocks his mother was collecting on the ridge. "Probably not the same kind," Silas said, "but a man who pays attention to rock grows up to know things other people don't." Tobias considered this. "Like my mother?" "Like your mother." Tobias looked satisfied. He took his hands back and tucked them under his own coat. Lillian had been watching this exchange. When Silas looked at her, she didn't look away, which was new. "Are your hands cold?" he asked. She considered the question with the gravity of a child who doesn't give careless answers. Then she nodded. He held out his hands. She placed her small ones in them with a deliberateness that made his chest do something complicated. He held them. The wind moved along the outside of the hayshed wall, and the horses shifted and settled, and the 4 of them sat in the cold, dry dark, and nobody said anything for a while. Clara, across the shed, was not looking at them. She was looking at the map. But her shoulders, which had been held up near her ears for the last 6 hours of difficult travel, had come down. They reached Denver on the morning of the 3rd day. The city was larger than Garnet in the way that all proper cities are larger than frontier towns. More noise, more motion, more of everything, including more of the particular indifference that cities have toward any individual person's urgency. The streets were busy with Christmas commerce, shop fronts dressed up, wagon traffic thick near the market areas. Silas found a boarding house near the land office district that took families, a detail he'd had to specify in Garnet when he arranged it by letter, which said something about whose needs the world was organized around. Mrs. Ferber, the proprietor, was a small, decisive woman who assessed the group at her door, a rancher, a woman, 2 children, and said 3rd floor, 2 rooms, 15 cents a night each, breakfast at 7, without making anything of it. That afternoon, Silas went to find Garrett Hale. He left Clara and the children at the boarding house because Hale's office was in a part of the city that was not particularly suited to a 4-year-old and a 6-year-old, and because Clara had survey documentation to organize. He put the oilcloth package into his hands at the door and said quietly, "Tell him everything. Don't decide what's relevant before you get there. Let him hear it all." Silas looked at her for a moment. "You've dealt with lawyers before," he said. "James dealt with lawyers. I watched him make the mistake of being too concise." She met his eyes. "Tell him everything." Garrett Hale was not what Silas had expected. He was small and neat, with the precise movements of a man who did not waste space, and he had a quality of attention that was almost uncomfortable, the sense of being read very accurately and very fast. He shook Silas's hand, waved him to a chair, and said, "Tell me what you have." Silas told him everything. The advertisement, Clara's arrival, the survey work on the ridge, the argentite sample, the galena formation, the maps with James Maddox's margin notations, the men in the yard, the burned barn, Briggs at the bank, the foreclosure timeline, the 2 failed refinancing applications in Garnett County institutions, Thorne's 6-year interest in the property, his method of operation with other ranchers, his pattern of identifying undervalued or distressed properties and engineering their acquisition. Hale listened without interrupting. He made notes. At the end, he sat back and looked at his notes for a moment. "The burned barn," he said. "You have no proof Thorne ordered that." "No." "The survey documentation, the Maddox notations, your wife's—" He paused. "Mrs. Maddox. Your arrangement is complicated," Silas said. Hale made a small neutral gesture that said he'd operated in complicated territory before and was not troubled by it. "Her documentation is the foundation of the claim. The quality of it matters." He looked up. "Is it good?" Silas thought about Clara on the ridge with the Brunton compass, about argentite, about her saying confident enough to file. "It's very good," he said. "Then you have a legitimate claim to file. The question is timing." Hale tapped his pen on the desk. "If Thorne has already moved on the deed—" "Has he?" Hale looked at him. "I have contacts in the title office. I'll know tomorrow morning." He paused. "There's another issue. Filing a mineral claim requires a locator's affidavit, someone who has physically marked the claim on site. Have you marked it?" Silas thought. They'd been so focused on the survey documentation that the physical marking, the standard practice of driving a post with the locator's information into the claim site, had been planned for the morning of departure and then overtaken by the barn fire. "No," he said. "We left before we could." Hale set down his pen. "That's a problem. The filing isn't valid without it." Silas sat with this for a moment. "I need to go back," he said. "Someone needs to go back and mark it before you file. Without that, how long do we have before Thorne could preempt the filing entirely? If he moves through the territorial office rather than the county, he could have a competing document filed by end of week." Hale looked at him steadily. "The filing window is narrow, Mr. Weston. Very narrow." Silas rode back to the boarding house in the early evening with the feeling of a man who has seen the shape of a problem clearly enough to know it is solvable and urgently enough to know that the solving cannot wait. Clara opened the door to the room on the 3rd floor, took one look at his face, and said, "What happened?" He told her about the locator's affidavit. She absorbed it with the stillness she used for processing bad news, and he watched her work through it and arrive at the same conclusion he'd arrived at outside Hale's office. "One of us has to go back," she said. "I'll go," he said immediately. "You need to be here. You're the landowner. Hale needs you for the deed documentation." She was already thinking through it, her eyes moving in that way they did when she was running logistics. "I can ride back faster alone. I know where the markers should go. I surveyed it. I can be there and back in 2 days if the weather holds." "The weather is not guaranteed to hold." "Nothing is guaranteed, Silas." It was the first time she'd used his first name. She said it without noticing, or without appearing to notice. "I know that ridge. I know exactly where to drive the post. It'll take me 20 minutes on site." She looked at him. "The children will be safe here with Mrs. Ferber. She's a sensible woman. Tobias will try her patience, but she can manage him." He looked at her. He thought about a widow who had packed 5 children onto a stagecoach with $42 and a collection of geological survey maps and traveled through December to a stranger's ranch on the chance that it might become a home. He thought about a woman who had stood on a rock ridge in the cold and held a piece of argentite and said confident enough to file without drama or performance. "Alone is not safe," he said. "Not with Thorne's men watching the roads." "Then come with me and we'll be back in 3 days." She held his gaze. "Or I'll go alone and be back in 2. Those are the options." Silas looked at her for a long moment. "Take the bay horse," he said. "She's steadier in the cold than the gray." He paused. "And take the rifle." Clara didn't argue about the rifle. She left the next morning before the city had fully woken, slipping out in the gray pre-dawn while Silas carried Tobias down to breakfast because the boy had decided that the stairs of the boarding house presented an interesting engineering challenge and could not be trusted to navigate them unsupervised at 6 in the morning. He told Tobias that his mother had gone on an errand. Tobias accepted this with the equanimity of a child who had been told many versions of "your mother has gone to handle something" and understood it as a natural feature of his life. Lillian said nothing, but after breakfast she went to the window that faced the street and stood there for a while looking out. Silas came and stood beside her, not too close, not making anything of it. After a while she said, "Is she coming back?" Her voice was steadier than it had been in the hay shed, more practiced. "Yes," he said. She looked at the street. Horses and wagons and the morning commerce of a city. "People say that," she said quietly. "They said it about Papa." The sentence landed in the room with the weight of everything it contained. A 4-year-old girl's accumulated knowledge of the gap between what people said and what actually happened, delivered without accusation, just as a statement of the world she'd learned to live in. Silas crouched down so he was at her level. "I know," he said. "People do say it, and sometimes they're wrong." He waited until she looked at him. "Your mother left this morning on a horse I know, on a road I know, to do something that she is better at than anyone else. And she is going to come back." He held her gaze. "I believe that. And I need you to hold on to that while I go and do my part of this." Lillian looked at him for a long moment with those dark, careful eyes. Then she put her small hand in his, deliberately, the same way she'd placed her cold hands in his in the hay shed, and held on. He stayed crouched at the window until she was ready to let go. Then he put on his coat, picked up the oilcloth package of documents, and went to meet Garrett Hale, because there was work to do and the window was narrow and Lawson Thorne was somewhere in this city making plans. And the only answer to a man who had spent 30 years taking things from people was to make sure that this time, on this piece of land, on this particular ridge in the Colorado Territory, there was nothing left for him to take. Garrett Hale's contact in the title office was a man named Pruitt, and Pruitt's news was not good. Hale delivered it the next morning across his desk with the directness of a man who understood that wrapping bad news in careful language only made it arrive slower and hurt the same. Thorne had filed an adverse claim document against the Weston deed 2 days prior, the day Silas and Clara had left the ranch. The document alleged that the original Weston land patent contained a survey error in its northern boundary description, which if sustained would effectively excise the ridge from Silas's legal property and place it in a disputed category that Thorne's lawyers could then petition to resolve in his favor. Silas sat with this for a moment. "A survey error," he said. "Alleged," Hale said. "The original patent was recorded in 1859. Thorne's document claims the surveyor at the time made an error in the bearing calculations for the northeast corner marker, which would shift the legal northern boundary approximately 300 yards south of where it currently sits on the ground. That puts the ridge outside my property. If the error is real, yes." Hale looked at him steadily. "Is there any possibility the error is real?" Silas thought about his father, who had walked every inch of that land 100 times and knew its edges the way other men knew their own faces. "No," he said. "My father was meticulous, and he had a surveyor rewalk the line in 1871 before he added the eastern pasture. There was no dispute then." "I'd want that 1871 survey on record." Hale made a note. "If it exists, it substantially weakens the adverse claim. A second survey finding the same boundary is strong evidence against an error." He paused. "Do you know where the 1871 documentation is?" Silas had a reasonably clear mental picture of the rolled paper tubes his father had kept in the bottom drawer of the desk in the ranch office. He had not opened that drawer in 3 years because it contained his father's handwriting, and he had not been ready to look at his father's handwriting. But he knew what was in it. "At the ranch," he said. "We'll need it here." Hale set down his pen. The adverse claim creates a cloud on the title. Any mineral claim we file while the title is clouded can be challenged on standing grounds. Thorne's lawyers will argue you don't have clear ownership of the land the deposit sits on, therefore you don't have standing to file. He planned this, Silas said. It wasn't surprise. It was the recognition of a pattern he'd been watching assemble itself for months, and was only now seen in full. He needed us to file the mineral claim while the title was in dispute. That gives him a mechanism to block the filing that looks purely procedural. That's exactly right. Hale looked at him. He's very good at this. I know. Silas was quiet for a moment. What clears the adverse claim fastest? A response filing with counter-documentation. The 1871 survey, any correspondence related to the original patent, testimony from anyone with personal knowledge of the boundary. Hale paused. And ideally, the mineral claim filed before the adverse claim can be adjudicated, because a valid prior filing on the mineral rights creates a separate legal track that's harder to disrupt through the title dispute. He folded his hands on the desk. Which means we need the locator's affidavit from the ridge. Soon. Mrs. Maddox left yesterday morning for the ranch, Silas said. She'll mark the claim and be back in 2 days. Hale looked at him. There was something in the look, not quite alarm, more like the expression a careful man makes when he's calculating a narrow margin. Thorne filed 2 days ago. His lawyers will be expecting a response window. If they have any intelligence on your movements, they might know she went back. Yes. Silas stood up. How long do I have to file the counter-response on the adverse claim? He said. 10 days from the filing date, which gives you 8 days from today. I'll need your help drafting it. Today, if possible. He was already moving toward the door. And I need to send a message to the ranch. Hale said, There's a telegraph office 2 blocks north. The telegraph to Nora Callahan's farm, the nearest line to the Weston ranch, cost Silas 40 cents and took 11 words. Clara returning. Watch for trouble on North Road. Keep children inside. He didn't know if Nora was checking the telegraph office. He didn't know if the message would reach the right ears in time. He sent it because it was the only thing he could do from 2 days' distance, and standing still felt like a particular kind of defeat. He went back to the boarding house between Hale's office and the telegraph office, checked on the children, found Tobias engaged in an apparently satisfactory negotiation with Mrs. Ferber over the question of whether he could help feed the kitchen cat, and found Lillian sitting at the window of the third-floor room with her legs folded under her, watching the street with the patience of a child who has decided that watching is the most useful available activity. Still no sign, he told her, which was not a lie. He couldn't see the road to Garnet from this window. She looked at him. How many days? She said 2. Lillian processed this. This is day 1. Yes. She turned back to the window. He left her there and went back to Hale's office and spent the afternoon in a chair across from a man who was very good at his work, going through the deed documentation line by line, building the counterfiling with the methodical attention of people who understand that the difference between winning and losing a legal argument is usually buried in a sentence somewhere that one party read carefully and the other didn't. It was slow work. It was important work. And somewhere on a winter road between Denver and Garnet, Clara Maddox was riding alone, with a rifle she knew how to use and a destination she knew how to find, and Silas Weston sat in a lawyer's office and drafted language and tried not to think about Thorne's men on that road. Hale's clerk brought coffee at 3 in the afternoon and news at 4. The news came from Pruitt again, in a folded note delivered by a boy of about 12 who accepted his coin and disappeared. Hale read the note, read it again, and then looked at Silas across the desk with the expression of a man who has received information that is both bad and clarifying. Thorne is in Denver, he said. Silas went still. He arrived this morning. He's staying at the Windsor. Hale set the note down. He has 2 lawyers with him. Pruitt says they were at the Territorial Land Office this afternoon asking about the processing timeline on the adverse claim. He paused. He's here to watch the filing window close. He came personally, Silas said. He's not the type of man who trusts the final step to someone else. Hale looked at him. This changes the calculation. If he's watching the land office, he'll know the moment we file. He'll know the moment we attempt to file. And if his lawyers are positioned to challenge the filing at the desk, Hale stopped himself. This is still manageable, but the margin is smaller than I'd like. Silas thought about Thorne in the Windsor Hotel, 2 miles from where he was sitting, with his lawyers and his practiced patience and 30 years of knowing exactly how to use the mechanisms of the system against people who didn't have equal access to those mechanisms. He thought about what Elijah had said about Clara. She was wrong about some things with my father and with other things. He hadn't asked about the other things. He was beginning to think the other things might have been trusting the wrong people in moments of vulnerability, trusting that the systems were neutral, that the law would operate on its own logic. If Thorne's lawyers challenged the filing at the desk, Silas said slowly, what's the ground? Title cloud. They'll produce the adverse claim document and argue you don't have standing to file a mineral claim while ownership is disputed. And the counter we've been drafting isn't filed yet. Hale looked at his work on the desk. If we file the counter response to the adverse claim first, it reopens the title question actively, which takes it into adjudication. While it's in adjudication, a simultaneous mineral claim filing has a better argument for standing because we can demonstrate the adverse claim is itself being contested. So we file the counter first thing tomorrow. The land office opens at 8. We'll be there at 8. There's a problem with that, Hale said. Silas waited. The counter response requires the 1871 survey as an exhibit. Without it, the counter is substantially weaker. Thorne's lawyers will point to the absence of corroborating survey data and argue the adverse claim is unresolved. Hale paused. And the mineral claim filing requires the locator's affidavit. Without Mrs. Maddox back with that affidavit, I know. Silas looked at the window. The afternoon light was going. She'll be back tomorrow. He said it with more certainty than he felt. Clara had made better time than she'd promised herself she would. The bay horse was everything Silas had said. Steady in the cold, sensible about ice. The kind of animal that had been worked enough to understand the difference between a problem worth shying at and a problem worth walking through. She'd pushed the pace on the first day and made Harker's station before dark, slept 4 hours on the bench in the common room because the rooms were full, and was back on the road by the time the sky was gray. The ranch road was empty when she turned onto it in the mid-morning of the second day. She'd been watching behind her for the last 2 hours, not with fear exactly, but with the focused alertness of someone who had identified a specific danger and was tracking for its signals. She'd seen no one on the valley route that concerned her, a freight wagon heading toward Denver, 2 riders heading south who paid her no attention. The road had been empty, and the emptiness was either good or the particular kind of good that turned out to be something else. She didn't stop at the house. She rode directly to the North Trail and up, the horse picking its way on the frozen track with careful, deliberate steps. The morning was clear and very cold, the mountains sharp against a pale sky. The kind of winter day that was beautiful in the way that indifferent things are sometimes beautiful. The ridge opened up before her the way it always did, sudden and total. She dismounted and tied the horse to a pine that she'd used before, and took the marking post from the pack behind the saddle. She'd cut it herself the previous week. A square post, 4 feet long, sharpened on one end, with the claim information written in clear block letters on a tin plate she'd nailed to its flat face. The writing said, Mineral Claim, Weston Property, located by C. Maddox, Decker 15, 1879. C. Territorial Record. She had the iron mallet in her other hand. The ground was frozen hard. This was going to take effort. She found the point she'd marked on the survey, the center of the argentite deposit, the intersection of the rock formation lines she'd documented, and positioned the post and swung the mallet. The impact rang out across the ridge, clear and carrying. She swung again. The post moved a half-inch. She worked at it methodically, not fast, maintaining the angle, the way James had taught her. Let the tool do the weight, you do the direction. 3 inches, 6. The ring of iron on wood carried down the ridge and into the valley below, and she thought nothing of it, because the ridge was empty, and the road below was empty, and she had a job to finish. She was driving the 8th stroke when she heard the horse. There were 2 of them, coming up the North Trail at a pace that said they hadn't come up casually. Clara stepped back from the post. It was 18 inches in the ground, not finished, but planted, visible, real. She had the mallet in her right hand and the rifle in the scabbard on the horse, which was 10 feet away. She did the calculation in the 3 seconds she had before they cleared the tree line. The rifle was too far. The mallet was what she had. She put the mallet down because holding it was a provocation, and she was not ready to be provoked yet, and she stood beside the post and waited. They came out of the trees and stopped their horses when they saw her. 2 men, large, both recognizable from the description Elijah had given. One of them was the man who had asked for Silas in the yard. He looked at her and looked at the post and looked at the tin plate with the claim information, and his expression went through several adjustments. "Mrs. Maddox," he said. He said it like he knew who she was, which told her they'd been told to expect her specifically. "Gentlemen," she said. "You want to stop what you're doing," he said. It wasn't quite a threat in its phrasing. It was the kind of statement that was constructed to sound like advice. "I've stopped," she said. The post was already in the ground. She had stopped. "What can I do for you?" He looked at the post again. His jaw moved. Then he looked at her with the expression of a man reassessing his situation. "Mr. Thorne has an interest in this ridge," he said. "Mr. Weston owns this ridge," she said. "Has for 20 years. There's a document that complicates that. There's also a document that contests that document." She held his gaze. She kept her voice level with the practiced calm of a woman who had learned that the moment fear showed in the voice was the moment the balance shifted. "We filed our response this morning in Denver, Mr. Hale's office, if you'd like to confirm." This was not true. The response had not yet been filed, but they didn't know that, and she had decided in the 2 seconds she'd had to think that a confident lie was more useful than an honest uncertainty. The man on the near horse was quiet for a moment. "That post," he said, "is part of a mineral claim filing, also being submitted in Denver." She paused. "Today." This was true. Or it would be true as soon as she got back and Silas had the affidavit. The 2 men looked at each other. She understood the calculation they were making. They had come up here to stop her from doing what she'd already done, and the doing was done. And the question now was what their next step was, and whether it was worth the escalation it would require. She was alone. She was a woman. Those 2 facts sat in the air between them as an apparent advantage on their side. But she was standing beside a legally filed claim marker, or what appeared to them to be one, and she had named a lawyer and an office, and that changed the risk arithmetic. "Mr. Thorne," the near man said slowly, "is not going to be pleased." "Mr. Thorne is welcome to make his displeasure known through the Territorial Land Office," Clara said. "That's the appropriate venue." She waited. He looked at her for a long moment with the frustrated expression of a man who had arrived prepared for one kind of confrontation and found a different kind waiting. Then he turned to his horse. The second man followed. They went back down the trail. Clara did not move until the sound of hooves on the frozen track had faded entirely. Then she picked up the mallet and drove the post 6 more strokes, until it was buried 2 feet in the frozen ground and was not going anywhere. She wrote the locator's affidavit on the ridge, sitting on a rock with the notebook on her knee, in the handwriting that James had called her best quality and her worst vanity because it was too neat to be natural. Small, regular letters with consistent pressure. The ink working in the cold with the reluctance of ink in cold weather. She dated it, signed it, and folded it into the oilcloth. Then she rode back down the ridge and pushed the bay horse as hard as the road would allow. Silas was at the window of the 3rd-floor room when she came up the boarding house street. He'd been watching the road at intervals all morning, not constantly. He'd been in Hale's office until 11, and at the telegraph office twice, and had twice walked the length of the block simply because staying still required more discipline than moving. Tobias had appointed himself the official window watcher in his absence, a role he performed with genuine dedication and a running commentary on the street traffic that would have been charming under other circumstances. It was Tobias who said, "There's a horse I think I know." Silas was across the room in 2 steps. The bay horse came down the center of the street at a tired but steady walk. Clara upright in the saddle with her coat dark from weather and her hat pushed back in her face, at this distance, unreadable but intact, which was the first and most important thing to read. He was downstairs and at the door before she'd dismounted. She handed him the oilcloth without preamble. "The affidavit's inside," she said. "The post is in the ground. 2 of Thorne's men came up to the ridge while I was working." She said it the way she said most things, factually, with the understanding that facts were what the situation required. He looked at her face. She was tired in a way that went down to the bone. "Are you all right?" he said. She seemed slightly startled by the question, as if she'd expected the next question to be about the document rather than about her. "Yes," she said, after a beat. "They didn't do anything. I think they weren't certain enough of their ground." She paused. "I may have implied the counterfiling had already happened. It hadn't. No, but it's happening today." She looked at him steadily. "Isn't it?" "In an hour," he said. "Hale is waiting." She put the horse in the care of the stable boy and went upstairs for 10 minutes. To see the children, he understood, to confirm with her own eyes that they were where she'd left them, and came back down with her coat straightened and her hat repinned and the particular settled quality she wore when she'd made her peace with something difficult and was ready to move. Hale filed both documents at the Territorial Land Office at 2 in the afternoon. He'd timed it deliberately, not at opening, when Thorne's lawyers would be positioned and prepared, but in the early afternoon when the office was busy with its ordinary business, and the filing would be one transaction among many. The counter-response to the adverse claim went in first, with the 1871 survey Silas had described attached as a certified copy. Hale's clerk had sent an urgent communication to the Garnett County Records Office 3 days prior, which had produced a copy by courier that morning, a small victory of preparation that Hale noted without making much of it. The mineral claim filing followed. The clerk at the desk was a middle-aged man named Dorsey, who had been processing land filings for 11 years and had the expression of someone who had long ago made peace with the fact that the documents on his desk represented, in aggregate, enormous quantities of human conflict. He took the mineral claim document and the locator's affidavit and the survey documentation and logged them into the receipt book in the unhurried manner of a person whose job did not change based on the urgency of the people in front of him. He stamped the filing date, December 15th, 1879. He handed Silas the receipt copy and said, "Next," to the person behind them. Silas looked at the receipt in his hand. He looked at it for a moment longer than was probably visible from the outside. Then he stepped back from the desk, and Clara was beside him, and Hale was beside both of them, and nobody said anything immediately, because there was a quality to the moment that speaking would have interrupted. "That's it?" Silas said. "That's the filing," Hale said. "The legal process that follows is longer, but the claim is on record, dated today with a prior filing date that precedes the adverse claim by the locator's affidavit date." He paused. "The locator date is what matters." Clara marked the claim before Thorne filed the adverse claim. "If that date holds—" "Does it hold?" Clara asked. "The documentation is solid. James Maddox's survey notes, the physical marking on site, your affidavit. I'd be surprised if a challenge to the date succeeded." He adjusted his hat. "I've seen worse cases win." Clara looked at Silas. He looked at her. They were standing in a government office in Denver in their travel clothes, both of them tired in ways that sleep wouldn't immediately fix, and the receipt was in his hand with a stamp on it, and it was not the end of anything. Not really. Hale had been clear about that. But it was the end of something. Thorne found out within the hour. Silas had expected this. A man who had sent people to watch the land office was a man who would have the results of those people's watching promptly delivered. He was not surprised when, at 4 in the afternoon, Hale received a message through his clerk that Lawson Thorne was requesting an urgent meeting. "He wants to negotiate," Hale said, reading the message. "He wants to see what we have," Silas said. "Both." Hale set the message down. "The question is whether it's worth your time to meet him." Silas thought about it for less time than he expected to. "Yes," he said. "I want to look at him." The meeting was arranged for 5 o'clock in the library room of the Windsor Hotel, which was Thorne's choice of venue, and communicated exactly what he intended it to communicate, that he was operating on his own ground, on his own terms, and expected the other party to adjust accordingly. Silas noted this and adjusted for it by arriving 3 minutes late, which was small and deliberate and possibly petty, but it was the ground available to him. Thorne was already seated when they arrived. He was older than Silas had expected, late 60s, with the well-maintained look of a man who had never missed a meal or spent an unnecessary hour in difficult weather. His face was broad, his clothes excellent, his hands folded on the table with the absolute patience of someone who was accustomed to waiting, because waiting had always eventually produced what he wanted. He had two lawyers flanking him like architectural features. He looked at Silas and Clara and Hale with the assessing calm of a man examining a situation he believed he still controlled. "Mr. Weston," he said, "sit down." Silas sat. Clara sat beside him. Hale took the chair to Silas's right. "I'll come to the point," Thorne said. "You've made a filing today. I'm aware of it. My attorneys are examining the documentation, and we have significant concerns about its validity." He looked at Silas. "I want to offer you a resolution." "What kind of resolution?" Silas said. "I'll withdraw the adverse claim against your deed. In exchange, you transfer the northern ridge, everything above the 700-foot elevation line, to my holding company. You retain the rest of the property free and clear, your mortgage debt with the Garnet Bank is retired, and you walk away with a clean deed and no further obligation." He said it smoothly, with the practiced ease of a man who had made similar offers before and had them accepted. Silas looked at him. He thought about what that offer contained. The ridge, the Argentite formation, everything that Clara had surveyed and documented and driven a post into in the frozen ground that morning while two men watched. He thought about 6 years of Thorne's attention on his land, the pressure on the bank, the burned barn, the men in the yard. He thought about what it meant that Thorne was sitting here offering a deal, which meant Thorne had looked at the filing and decided that fighting it was going to cost him something. "No," Silas said. Thorne's expression didn't change by much, just a slight adjustment around the eyes, the micro-expression of a man recalibrating. "The offer is generous, Mr. Weston. Your deed is clouded. Your mineral claim is going to be challenged on multiple. Your adverse claim is being contested with the 1871 survey documentation," Hale said pleasantly, "which predates your alleged error by 18 years and was conducted by the same territorial surveying office that issued the original patent." One of the lawyers said something to Thorne in a low voice. Thorne did not look at him. He kept looking at Silas. "You don't have the resources for a prolonged legal contest," Thorne said. It wasn't cruel. It was just information, delivered in the tone of someone who considered information and leverage to be the same thing. "That may be true," Silas said, "but I have a valid mineral claim on file, dated prior to your adverse claim by the locator's affidavit. I have a counter-response to your deed challenge on record, and I have a lawyer." He paused. "What I don't have is a reason to give you something you didn't earn." Thorne looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Clara. It was the first time he'd looked directly at her since they'd sat down. His gaze was the measuring kind, the look of a man who was accustomed to assessing people by their visible position and had not yet decided what category she fit into. "You're the woman from the advertisement," he said. Clara met his gaze without difficulty. "I'm Clara Maddox," she said. "You did the survey work." "I did." He looked at the table for a moment, then back at her. "Your husband was James Maddox, worked for the Henderson Mining Company out of Nevada." Something shifted in Clara's face, barely visible, just a slight tightening. "Yes." "I knew of his work," Thorne said. "He was good." There was something in the way he said it, not quite respect, more like the acknowledgement a man gave to a tool that had worked well. "He found 3 deposits in Nevada that Henderson made fortunes on." "I know," Clara said. "He told me about all of them. And you're telling me you found silver on this ridge." "Argentite, yes." Thorne sat back slightly. He looked at the table again, and for a moment the practiced composure had something working underneath it that Silas couldn't quite identify. It wasn't quite surprise, it was more like the expression of a man who had been operating on an assumption and was discovering the assumption was further wrong than he'd calculated. "How much?" Thorne said. "I don't know yet," Clara said, "but enough that you came to Denver personally to manage the claim window, which suggests you have a reasonable estimate." The silence in the library room was the kind that has texture. One of Thorne's lawyers put a hand on his arm and said quietly, "Lawson?" Thorne ignored it. He looked at Silas. "The offer stands," he said. "I'd suggest you consider it carefully." "I've considered it," Silas said. "The answer is still no." Thorne stood. His lawyers stood with him, gathering papers with the practiced efficiency of men whose job required them to be ready to leave at a moment's notice. He buttoned his coat with the unhurried movements of a man who wanted to communicate that none of this had disturbed him. But something had disturbed him. Silas could see it in the deliberateness of those movements, the way a person gets more controlled, not less, when they're managing something underneath. You'll be hearing from my attorneys, Thorne said. We'll look forward to it, Hale said pleasantly. Thorne walked out. The three of them sat in the library room for a moment after he'd gone. Then Clara said quietly, He had someone survey this ridge. Silas looked at her. He knew the deposit was there before we filed. He had an estimate. She looked at the door Thorne had walked through. He paid someone to survey your land without your knowledge. That's not an adverse claim. That's a conspiracy to defraud. Hale had gone very still. If you could prove that, he said carefully, his surveyor would have field notes, a report. Someone in his organization has a copy of the survey that told him what was on that ridge. Clara looked at Hale. Is there a mechanism to compel disclosure? Hale was quiet for a moment, the quality of quiet that meant something was being assembled. In the context of contesting the adverse claim, we could argue that his knowledge of the mineral deposit is relevant to his motive for filing. That argument, if sustained, would allow discovery of his documents. He paused. It's not a guaranteed avenue, but it exists. Use it, Silas said. They walked out of the Windsor Hotel into the December evening, the city full of Christmas movement around them, shop lights, horses, the sound of a distant fiddle from somewhere down the block. The air was cold and clear. Clara stopped on the sidewalk. She put her hand over her mouth for a moment, briefly, the gesture of a person who has been holding something controlled for a long time and is now, in the first available private moment, allowing themselves to feel the shape of what they've done. Silas stopped beside her. He didn't say anything. He waited. She took a breath. She took her hand down. She looked at the street. The children, she said. I need to see the children. Yes, he said. They walked back to the boarding house through the cold city evening, and when they came through Mrs. Ferber's front door, Tobias was at the bottom of the stairs and had clearly been listening for them because he appeared at the sound of the door with the speed of a child who had been waiting with considerable impatience. He looked at his mother's face, and then he launched himself off the second step directly into her arms, which she caught by reflex with the automatic ease of a woman who had been catching this particular child for 6 years. And he said into her shoulder with the directness that was entirely his own, Did it work? Clara held him. Yes, she said. It worked. Silas stood in the doorway of the boarding house and watched a woman hold her son in the front hall while the city moved outside and the lamp on the table made a warm circle on the floor. And he thought about receipts with stamps on them and a post in the frozen ground, and 30 years of Lawson Thorne arranging the world to his specifications, finally meeting something he couldn't simply rearrange. And he thought, with a quietness that surprised him by being something close to peace, that it was not finished, that there were lawyers ahead and filings and a legal process that would take months and be difficult and uncertain in the way that anything real was uncertain. It was not finished, but the ground had shifted. Upstairs he could hear Lillian's voice, asking something, Ruth's answer, the ordinary sounds of children existing in a space. And he thought about spring, which was what he'd promised when a small girl had asked him if it ever stopped being cold. It stopped in the spring. He was starting, carefully, to believe it. They came home on the 20th of December. The ranch road was the same frozen ruts it had always been, the same scrubby pines bending in the same wind off the same mountains. And yet Silas noticed things on the drive in that he hadn't noticed on the drive out, or hadn't noticed in a long time before that. The way the afternoon light came flat and silver across the eastern pasture. The particular blue of the shadow line where the ridge met the sky. Small things, the kind that accumulate without announcement, when a person starts paying attention again after a period of not paying attention. Tobias was asleep in the wagon bed. Lillian was not. She sat beside Clara on the bench with her eyes on the road ahead, and when the ranch came into view around the familiar bend, the house, the ruined barn foundation, the fence line, the smoke from the chimney, she said quietly and without particular drama, "We're back." "We're back," Clara said. Silas guided the horse through the gate. Elijah came out of the house before the wagon had fully stopped, and behind him Ruth and Samuel, and the particular quality of relief on Elijah's face when he saw his mother was something he covered quickly, but not quite quickly enough. He was 14. He had managed a ranch and 3 younger siblings for 8 days in December, while his mother rode into uncertain territory, and he had done it without complaint or visible faltering, and it had cost him something that he was not going to name. He helped his mother down from the wagon. She put both hands on his face briefly, the way she touched all her children when she'd been away, quick and sure, a checking of the inventory of them, and said, "You did well." He nodded. Then he stepped back and looked at Silas. "How did it go?" "We filed," Silas said. "Both the mineral claim and the counter-response to Thorne's deed challenge. It's in the territorial record." Elijah processed this. "Is it done?" "The filing is done. The legal process runs from here." Silas stepped down from the wagon. "Which means it'll be months before anything is fully resolved. But the ground is different now." He paused, looking at the boy. "You kept this place standing. That mattered." Elijah didn't say anything to that. He looked at the ruined barn foundation and then back at Silas, and something passed across his face that was complicated enough that it would have taken a long time to name all its components. "Nora Callahan came 4 times, he said. "Not 2. She said twice wasn't enough." Silas made a mental note to bring Nora a very good Christmas gift. "She's right," he said. It wasn't. The letter from Garrett Hale arrived the first week of January. Silas read it at the kitchen table with Clara across from him and the children making the ordinary morning noise of children getting ready for the day. And he read the important part aloud. Thorne's attorneys had withdrawn the adverse claim. Clara looked up from her coffee. He continued reading. The withdrawal had come after Hale filed the discovery motion. The argument that Thorne's knowledge of the mineral deposit was material to the motive for the adverse claim, and therefore his survey documentation was subject to disclosure. Thorne's lawyers had fought the motion for 11 days, and then on the 12th day, had withdrawn the adverse claim without explanation and without prejudice. Without prejudice meant Thorne could theoretically refile, but Hale's accompanying note made clear that the withdrawal under discovery pressure had created a record, that if Thorne ever moved against the Weston deed again, that record would be the first thing any court would see. "He blinked," Clara said. "He blinked," Silas said. The phrase sat in the room between them and was sufficient. What it meant practically was this. The mineral claim was now the primary legal instrument in play, uncontested, with a clear title behind it. Hale was in contact with 2 mining companies out of Colorado Springs who had expressed preliminary interest in the Weston Ridge deposit. He advised Silas not to enter any agreement without his review and not to allow anyone onto the property for assessment purposes without a signed preliminary agreement in place first. He had also, in a final paragraph written with the particular dry satisfaction of a man who enjoyed his work when it went correctly, noted that Harold Briggs at the Garnett County Bank had been replaced as branch manager by the parent institution in Denver, effective the first of the year, citing irregularities in the management of certain commercial lending relationships. Silas read that paragraph twice. He didn't feel satisfaction exactly. He felt something quieter. The particular feeling of a wrong thing being corrected, which was not the same as triumph, and was, he thought, probably more durable. He folded the letter and set it on the table. Samuel, who had been within earshot and had been unsuccessfully pretending to read, said, "What are irregularities in commercial lending relationships?" "It means Mr. Briggs was helping someone he shouldn't have been helping," Clara said. Samuel considered this. "Mr. Thorne." "Almost certainly, but they can't prove it." "They don't need to prove it to remove him," Clara said. "They just need to know it." Samuel nodded and went back to his book. He had the quality of a person who filed information away in an organized interior system and retrieved it when needed. Silas had begun to think that Samuel was going to grow into someone formidable, in the quiet way that people who pay close attention to everything usually did. The neighbors came in February. It started with Walt Greer from the property south of the creek, who arrived one Saturday morning with his 2 oldest sons and a wagon of lumber, and said only, "We heard you lost your barn," as if 8 weeks had not passed since the fire, and as if showing up with building materials required no particular explanation. Silas stood in the yard and looked at the lumber, and looked at Walt Greer and said, "That's right." "Well," Walt said, "it's Saturday." By mid-morning, there were 4 wagons in the yard. Nora Callahan came with her ranch hand and a pot of something hot that she set on the porch without ceremony. The Alderman brothers from the North Valley came with tools. A family Silas barely knew. The Vasquez family, who had moved into the old Harker place 6 months prior. came with their 3 grown sons and a coil of good rope and an absolute willingness to work that required no common language to communicate. Clara stood beside Silas and watched the yard fill. "Did you arrange this?" he asked. "No," she said. And then, after a moment, "Nora might have." Nora Callahan, when Silas looked at her across the yard, was already directing 2 of Walt Greer's sons on the placement of the foundation posts with the authority of a woman who had built things before and knew which people to trust with the structural decisions. She caught Silas's eye and gave him a small nod that communicated nothing except that she was getting on with it. The barn took 3 Saturdays to raise. It was not his father's barn. It was smaller, built for what Silas actually needed, rather than what the original had been designed for, and the lumber was mixed, some new, some salvaged, some donated in dimensions that didn't quite match and had to be worked around. It was imperfect in the way that things built by many hands under varying conditions were always imperfect, and Silas thought it was, for that reason, more honest than the original. Elijah worked every one of those Saturdays without being asked. He worked alongside the men without the self-consciousness that most 14-year-olds brought to adult company, and by the 3rd Saturday, Walt Greer's oldest son, who was 19 and not given to easy compliments, told Elijah he had good instincts for framing, which Elijah received with a nod and no visible pleasure, the way people received compliments when the thing being complimented was something they'd worked hard on and considered serious. Silas watched this from across the barn frame and thought about a boy who had stood in the yard alone in front of 2 large men and had not stepped back, and had said, "At least you said so," to a stranger who told him the truth, and had managed a ranch for 8 days in December without anyone knowing what it cost him. He didn't say any of this to Elijah. Some things were better observed than spoken. The mining company representative came in March. His name was Alderson. He was from Colorado Springs, and he had the brisk, knowledgeable manner of a man who had assessed a great many mineral claims and had developed the professional habit of being accurate without being generous. He spent 2 days on the ridge with his own instruments, took his own samples, and sat down with Silas and Clara at the kitchen table on the 3rd evening and opened his notebook. "The deposit is real," he said. "Argentite primary ore, with secondary galena throughout the formation. The vein runs approximately 400 feet along the ridge at a consistent depth." He turned the notebook to show them a diagram. "Conservative yield estimate is $60,000 over a 7-year extraction window at current silver prices. Could be more if the vein extends beneath the granite intrusion, which I suspect it does." The number sat on the table. $60,000 was more money than Silas's family had seen across 3 generations of ranching combined. He looked at Clara. She was looking at the diagram with the focused expression of someone checking the assessment against their own data. She pointed to a notation near the eastern edge. "What's this formation here?" Alderson looked. "Secondary pocket. Less certain. Could be an extension, could be a separate minor vein. My survey puts that pocket at a different bearing than your notation," she said. She reached for James Maddox's notebook, opened it to a specific page, and placed it beside Alderson's diagram. "Here. If this bearing is right, the pocket isn't secondary. It's the western edge of a broader structure." Alderson looked at the notation. He looked at it for a long moment. "This is James Maddox's work," he said. "Yes, I know his notation system." He was quiet for a moment, reading. "If he's right about this bearing—" He stopped. He looked at Clara. "You did the survey work here." "I did." He looked back at the notebook. "Then I may have underestimated the eastern edge." He closed his own notebook and opened it again to a fresh page. "I'd like to walk that section with you tomorrow morning." Clara said, 7 o'clock. Alderson was there at 6:55. The final agreement with the Colorado Springs Company was signed in April. Hale came from Denver for the signing. He said it was professional necessity, but he arrived the day before with the slight extra ease of a man who had enjoyed the circumstances of a case and wasn't in a hurry to leave them. He sat at the kitchen table while Clara went through the contract terms 1 clause at a time, and at one point looked at Silas over the top of the document and raised his eyebrows very slightly, which was the most expressive Silas had seen him. The terms were better than the initial offer, significantly better, because Alderson's revised assessment, incorporating Clara's survey data on the eastern formation, had elevated the projected yield estimate to a range that changed the negotiating position substantially. The company retained extraction rights for 8 years. Silas retained full surface rights and land ownership. The signing bonus retired the bank debt entirely, with enough remaining to rebuild the cattle operation properly. Silas signed his name on the line and set down the pen. He looked at the document for a moment. He thought about his father, who had bought this land because the grass was good, and had no idea what was under the rock. He thought about 3 years of slow loss, the cattle, the mortgage, the hollow quiet of a house that had once held more life than it currently did. He thought about a desperate letter mailed to a newspaper, and a woman who had not mentioned 5 children, and the particular sound of a wagon full of people he didn't know pulling up to a house that had been empty too long. He thought, none of this was what I planned for, not one part of it. And yet here was a document with his name on it, and across the table was a woman who had read the rock on his northern ridge and been right about it. And somewhere in the back of the house were children who had started to treat this place with the casual familiarity of people who considered it home. The way Tobias left his shoes by the door, as if the door had always been his to leave shoes beside. The way Ruth had taken over the kitchen garden with an organizational confidence that suggested she had already decided what would be planted where. The way Samuel had quietly moved his books to the shelf near the window, as if the shelf had been waiting for them. He said to Clara, later, when the others had gone, "I want to ask you something." She was washing the supper dishes. She kept washing them. "All right," she said. "I know the arrangement we came in under," he said. "I know it was practical, and I know it was imperfect, and I know it started with me being angry and you having been less than honest." He paused. "I'm not pretending any of that isn't what it is." She set a cup on the drying rack and picked up another. "But I'd like—" He stopped. He was not a man who found this kind of sentence easy. "I'd like to ask if you'd be willing to make it a real marriage. Not a practical one. A real one." Clara was quiet for a moment. She finished the cup she was washing and set it down and dried her hands and turned around. Her face had the particular stillness she wore when she was thinking through something important, and he waited for it, because he'd learned by now that her silences were part of her thinking and not gaps in it. "I came here," she said, "because I needed a place to go. I want you to know that I know that. I'm not going to pretend I arrived for better reasons than I did. I placed an advertisement because I was desperate," he said. "Same foundation." Something moved in her face. "Yes." "So the question is what we're building on it," he said, "not what we started with." She looked at him for a long moment. "The children need to be asked," she said. "I know. Elijah especially. He's old enough that his opinion matters." "I agree." She nodded slowly. It was not a yes, exactly. It was the acceptance of the conversation being real, which was a different and possibly more significant thing. He talked to Elijah the next morning at the south fence line, where they were checking the winter's damage with the ease of 2 people who had made a habit of working together. He said what he was thinking directly, because that was what Elijah responded to. Elijah listened. He walked alongside the fence line and looked at it and was quiet for a moment after Silas finished. Then he said, "I've been waiting for you to either leave or stay." Silas looked at him. "Men in our situation before," Elijah said carefully, "usually left, eventually, or they were never really there to begin with." He picked up a loose staple from the ground and turned it in his fingers. "You went to Denver. You came back. You signed the document." He paused. "You drove the post into the frozen ground of that ridge before you left, in a blizzard, and you came back to it." "Your mother drove the post," Silas said. "I know, but you went back for it." He turned to look at Silas directly. "Same thing." They stood at the fence line in the April morning, the mountains going green at the lower elevations now the way they did in spring, tentatively, the color working back into the landscape from the bottom up. Elijah said, "She's happy here. That's not something I've seen in a while." He didn't say yes, and he didn't say anything else. He put the staple in his coat pocket and picked up the wire tool and kept walking the fence line, and Silas walked beside him, and that was enough. The ceremony was small and practical, which suited both of them. The justice of the peace in Garnet was a man named Alcott, who had married approximately 80 couples in 20 years and had developed the efficient warmth of someone who understood that the words mattered, but the people speaking them mattered more. He conducted it in his office on a Tuesday morning in May, with all 5 children present and Nora Callahan standing near the door, because she had arrived uninvited and no one had told her to leave. Tobias stood at rigid attention for approximately 4 minutes and then began examining the contents of Alcott's bookshelf, which Clara allowed because 4 minutes of rigid attention from Tobias was a personal record. Ruth cried quietly, in the way she did everything, contained and private, dabbing at her face with the corner of her sleeve when she thought no one was looking. Samuel was not crying, but his face had the particular worked quality of someone who was managing something he hadn't expected to feel. Elijah stood with his arms folded and his shoulders straight, and at the moment when Alcott asked if anyone had objection, Tobias looked up from the bookshelf and said cheerfully, "No," as if he'd been monitoring the proceedings all along. Nobody objected. And Lillian, 4 years old, dark-eyed, still using her voice carefully as if it were something valuable that had been returned to her and she wasn't yet sure of its full range, stood beside Silas throughout, and when it was over she reached up and took his hand. He looked down at her. She was looking at her mother and Alcott in the room, taking inventory the way she always did. Then she looked up at Silas. "Are we still a family?" she said. The question was sincere, entirely without guile. A child checking the status of something important, confirming that the thing she'd come to believe in was still the thing it appeared to be. He crouched down. "Yes," he said, "we are." She considered this seriously for a moment. Then she nodded, the small decisive nod of someone who has received a satisfactory answer to a question they needed answered, and went back to watching her mother. What? There is something worth saying about what this kind of story actually is. Not the legal victory, though, that mattered. Not the silver in the ridge, though, that changed everything practical. What this story is, underneath all of it, is about the particular human stubbornness of deciding that the situation you're in, however badly it started, is worth building on. Silas Weston placed an advertisement out of desperation and got something he didn't ask for and didn't want, and instead of sending it back, he fed it supper and let it stay. That's not heroism. It's not even generosity. Not exactly. It's just a person choosing, in the moment when choice is possible, not to make the worst available decision. Clara Maddox came to a stranger's house with 5 children and a dead man's maps, and the combination of nerve and dishonesty that desperation produces in people who are otherwise decent, and she made herself useful in the most literal way. She read the rock, she drove the post, she stood on a ridge in front of 2 large men and did not run. She was not fearless. She was afraid, and she did the thing anyway, which is the only way the thing ever gets done. The children were not rescued. Children in real life rarely are, not in the clean sense. What happened was slower and messier. A boy who expected to be disappointed being surprised, gradually, by not being disappointed. A little girl finding her voice not because someone performed a kindness at her, but because the house she was in became, over months of ordinary days, a place she trusted enough to speak in. Lawson Thorne lost. He lost not because fate or justice arranged itself neatly against him, but because the specific people he underestimated turned out to be more competent, more persistent, and more willing to endure discomfort than he had calculated. He had built his entire operation on the assumption that people without resources would eventually exhaust themselves. He was wrong about these particular people. That's all. The system that enabled him was still there. It would enable someone else next year and the year after that. But on this piece of land, on this ridge, with these people, it ran out of road. What Silas had ordered when he mailed that letter was a practical arrangement. Someone to share the work and the silence and the slow emergency of a failing ranch. What he got was a woman who knew how to read rock, a 14-year-old who would not step back, a boy who paid attention to everything, a girl who organized the world into things worth doing, a 6-year-old who found delight in things with complete reliability, and a child who had lost her voice and found it again in a kitchen by a fire on a December night by asking a simple question and being answered. Nobody gets what they order. That's not a comfortable truth, especially when what you ordered was born of desperation and what arrived seems like it might be worse. But there is something in the discrepancy between what we ask for and what we receive that sometimes, not always, not reliably, but sometimes, contains the thing we actually needed without knowing how to name it. Silas Weston didn't know he needed a family. He had already had one and lost it, and the loss had settled into him like weather into rock. Slowly, deeply, changing the structure from the inside. He hadn't been looking for another because you can't look for something you've stopped believing in. But on a December afternoon, on a frontier road in Colorado, A wagon pulled up to a house that had been empty too long, and a woman climbed down, and then a boy, and then another boy, and then a girl with her arms crossed, and then a small boy looking at everything with delight, and then, last, a little girl who pressed her face into her mother's neck and said nothing. And a man who had been alone for 3 years stood in the frozen yard and looked at all of them and thought, I cannot possibly manage this. He was right. He couldn't manage it alone. That was, it turned out, exactly the point.